Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? Well, thank you, Davis, and thank you, Holly, for all of, Holly was great at helping me get all of my arrangements for getting here and acquainting me with the area. This is my first time to the University of Oregon, and I'm very pleased to be here, and I'd like to congratulate the journal staff and candidates and the University of Oregon School of Law for taking on this very timely and very critical subject. One thing I do have to mention, as Davis pointed out, I'm the director of our LLM program in Ag and Food Law. And while we have, over the years, we've had students from about 35 different states, probably 15 foreign countries. So we're pretty, we have the distinction of being the only LLM in Ag and Food Law. So that helps us to be the best, I suppose, as well. But if people want to study with us, they have to come to Arkansas. And that gives us a lot of advantages in terms of having a diverse student population. But where I'm going with this is that I'm very pleased that this year we have our first University of Oregon students in the program, and we got 3 of them. So this was quite exciting for us. We've got Cassie Peters, who's here in the audience with us today. She came back for the conference. And Jeremy Pyle, who was last year's editor of the journal, and Rich Burnett. And they're a great addition to the program, and so we're very happy to have them. And their presence in our program made me even more pleased to have the opportunity to come out here and work with the journal and participate here in the conference. So let's get going. Thoughts on affecting change. I wasn't sure exactly what we'd be doing with the morning panels, so I wanted to sort of start with an idea of what I think of when we talk about industrialized agriculture. And as you can see on this slide, I focus on 3 specific attributes. The first is just the large-scale production of a specialized uniform product. And when you look at these and you think about this model, we're just doing with agriculture what manufacturing has done with production, whether it's General Motors or the proverbial widget that you talk about in your law school classes. But we're going to produce a specialized uniform product. We're going to use technology to achieve increased production with a real focus on decreasing the per unit price and the uniformity of products. Vertical integration, control over all stages of production by the processor. That's why we have in industrialized agriculture, that's why we have poultry companies that own the chicks all the way through the process, and the farmer just cares for them according to the contract language. That's why we have all of the contracting issues right now that the USDA Grain Inspection and Packers and Stockyards Act agency is battling for because of the concentration in the industry and some of the problems contracting. But those are the 3 elements that I use. So when I use the term industrialized agriculture, this is what I'm talking about. The problem that I have with the model is not one that involves whether Walmart's doing it or whether Smithfield's doing it or whatever. It's just, I think that there are some just real inherent difficulties with applying this model to something that is targeted toward the production of living products. And that's what makes agriculture different. Agriculture is the production of living products with an inherent reliance on natural resources and natural processes. And as anybody learns in your Biology 101 class, or certainly learns in experience if you try to garden the same land over and over again, nature favors diversity. Industrialized agriculture is on the opposite end of that continuum. So what's happened in agriculture is an increased need for technological fixes to try to get over the problems that we're creating by not having a more diverse system based on natural production. And we've got our anaerobic digestion system up there, which is being developed to deal with the large waste lagoons that Charlie showed us. I guess you didn't have any specific lagoons in your presentation, but Same, you know, we got a problem, we'll find a technological fix. The chickens, I love this picture here. That's a chicken on the left, chicken in 1957. And the far right is the chicken that you would now purchase is as a broiler from industrialized production. And then, of course, we have pesticide applications to deal with the effects of monoculture production in crops. Now, to a certain extent, you have to give this system credit for working in one capacity. And I've got some statistics up here for the absolutely dramatic increase in production that we've seen. And I think we have to be realistic about this, particularly if you have problems with the industrialized system. You can't pretend that it doesn't work in a short-term basis. But at what cost? And here what we're seeing is increased and increasing problems with production that are coming up, which we're then going to have to try to achieve additional technological advances in order to try to fix. We have infection and disease and in reliance on antibiotics. It was very telling when in the hearings where the FDA is trying to clamp down on the use of antibiotics in livestock production. I think probably most of you in here have heard the statistic that about 70% of the antibiotics that we manufacture in the United States are used in animal production. Obviously, some of those are used for sick animals, but the vast majority of them are used for subtherapeutic use, which acts either to prevent disease or acts as a growth promotant. So we've got a tremendous amount of antibiotic use in agriculture. One of the reasons that some of the farm groups were lobbying and are lobbying to this day for the FDA to not cut down on the use is because they said, well, we have to be able to use these antibiotics and we have to be able to use the new ones as fast as they come out, and we can't just have labeled use for them because we're seeing all kinds of diseases that the old antibiotics aren't working for. So when you talk about antibiotic resistance, you're not just talking about whether or not it's affecting you and you may get antibiotic resistant infection. It's also a problem in the animal industry that we're struggling to deal with. Water and air pollution, Charlie did a very good job with showcasing some of the pollution from the dairy industry here. Professor Burkett this morning had some very convincing arguments about climate change. Loss of biodiversity. This is another issue. Think back at the pictures of the chicken there. The vast majority of livestock that we're producing now worldwide comes from a very, very small genetic pool. And in fact, some of the breeds that were very, very common 50 years ago are very difficult to even find these days. Economic and social decline of rural communities. I think most people, certainly some of the statistics that we've seen so far about the reduced number of farmers, larger farms, the effect of that on our rural communities has been very difficult. Food safety concerns, we've had some excellent speakers so far on those issues, and animal welfare concerns. Also something that is very much in the forefront of questioning our industrialized practices. And I'm actually going to focus a lot of my presentation today on industrialized agriculture with respect to animal production, partly because that's also driving a lot of our industrialized crop production as well. The rise of big food and big ag, however you define those terms or however, which companies fit into that, this system has been very profitable for a number of companies. It's also dramatically altered our consumer eating habits and obesity and diet-related health problems, many, many complicated causes, but certainly agriculture and our food system has to step up to the table for having a share of the impact. One of the things that I wanted to emphasize, I was very pleased to hear people talking about the local food issues and talking about what we can all do as consumers here, but I think we have to not lose sight of the fact that this is a lot bigger than just what we do here in Eugene or what we do here in the United States. We are exporting an industrialized model of agriculture to countries all over the world. And I say we, I'm not necessarily talking about the United States, I'm talking about multinational corporations, and I'm also talking about the role of America as a leader worldwide and other countries emulating our policies. There's been a dramatic increase in industrialized production worldwide. Again, we've got the US example, and we tout those statistics of how well this is working. We have multinational corporations that see developing countries as a wonderful new market. It's cheap production costs, very low regulation of environmental degradation, new markets for people to increase meat production or meat consumption. And third, our U.S. export policies. We have, in fact, devastated some of the small farm production of livestock in some developing countries by the export of cheap meat products. Think about the dark meat of chicken that we don't like to eat particularly well or isn't popular, as popular here in the United States. Most of that all goes to an export market. And Tyson Foods and Pilgrim Pride and those companies can export those products cheaper than the local farmer in the Philippines or in Thailand or in Romania may be able to produce it. And fourth, what we're seeing in many of these countries is to sort of jump onto the free trade bandwagon. They're encouraging their own farmers to shift to production of foods for export as opposed to creating sustainable food systems within the country. And now certainly there are economic reasons for that, but for someone who's concerned about a sustainable food system, I think it presents problems. Okay, here's are just some statistics on what we're doing with meat production these days, and 1.7 billion animals worldwide today, tripled in the last 3 decades. About a third of our arable land right now is used for growing feed for all of those animals. And the statistics say that that production is going to double again by 2050. I've got the source here for my statistics here. There's a new book that just came out from Island Press called Livestock in a Changing Landscape. I've only had an opportunity to read a couple of reviews of it. I haven't seen it. It's a 2-treatise volume, and I am looking forward to taking a look at it. Industrialized livestock right now is growing at 7 times the rate of livestock production on a small scale. As I've said, what's happening in many of these developing countries is we've got large industrialized meat operations that are coming in and displacing the farmers that have been growing in sort of what would be akin to our family farm system of agriculture here, and as well the imports of the cheap meat from the United States, from Brazil, from other meat-producing exporters. This, and I'm sorry, it's probably too many words for a good slide here, but I really wanted to provide all the information in here. Back in 2009, the New York Times published an article on Smithfield's development of their large hog operations in Poland and Romania. And it was really a devastating report to read about. Aside from how you feel about the actual meat that they're producing, in Romania, as I point out here in Romania, the number of hog farms declined by 90%. I mean, they were just really putting a lot of small farmers out of production. They have experienced some tremendous environmental problems. They had a major swine flu epidemic that also ended up creating problems for producers that were trying to stay out of the industrialized system. It was a very sad situation. 56% reduction in Poland. These were countries that used to have small farm operations where you would do things the way that now people talk about sustainable agriculture, of a diverse operation where you raise some crops, you produce some livestock, you've got livestock, you're a sustainable system within the terms of providing food for the family and then selling the export or the excess production. Now, I'm not saying that those systems shouldn't have some improvements. I'm not saying that we shouldn't have technological advances or that we shouldn't be assisting some of those farmers with some of their agricultural practices. You know, I don't want you to misconstrue my message as saying that we all need to be, to remain in the agriculture of the 1930s. But on the other hand, the direction that this has gone for these countries has really devastated the rural economies. If any of you get an opportunity, you can get most of the excerpts of it on YouTube. But Pig Business was a very controversial film that was produced in the UK, and you can only believe a certain percentage of what you read on the internet. But the internet stories on it was that Smithfield threatened litigation, and it was not released for major distribution, is the word I'm looking for. And so, but now, of course, you know, also the beauty of the internet is things leak out, and you can find most of it, most of the episodes on YouTube. You know, obviously there may be some inaccuracies with some of the statistics that they have in the film, but I think it does really capture very accurately some of the angst in the rural communities about companies moving in and changing their way of life in the agricultural sector. Well, redirecting agriculture toward a more sustainable goal. I don't want to just depress everybody about how awful industrialization is. Oh, I'd like to have sort of an upbeat component here. First of all, I want to start by considering big food and big ag and encourage people to not just focus on vilifying large corporations. They are what we have created them to be. I think I missed, yeah, here. This is a quote from Marion Nestle, who, if any of you know Marion's work, she's not a fan of big food. Corporations must make the financial return to stockholders their first priority. Now, we've got, shaking your head, we've got, you know, I will get to corporate social responsibility in just a second, but essentially the corporate model has a great deal of focus on the return of profitability to shareholders. And to a certain extent, sometimes when we vilify corporations for making a lot of money and wanting to make a lot of money, we sometimes are forgetting a little bit of the responsibility that we have and that government may have for how we have set these up, because they are a creature of our creation. This is a wild quote. I just had to use this because it sort of set me back. It's back from 1970, and it's Milton Friedman, and he's sort of scoffing at the notion of social responsibility. His point is that corporations are, their job, basically, is to produce profits, so long as they stay within the rules of the game. And remember that phrase. Why is industrialized agriculture so profitable? If it was not profitable, Smithfield would not be doing it. Tyson Foods would not be doing it. There is profit to be made, and that, I think, is what we need to look at in order to really have any systemic change of where we're going in this direction. And two things that I'll focus on primarily are, number one, the externalities, the costs that are associated with industrial production, which are not factored into the cost of food. And second, the subsidies, sometimes hidden subsidies, that we have that, again, makes it more profitable and, in fact, tips the scale on a system of production that everybody says, oh, well, the reason we're doing it is because it's so much more economically efficient. Well, if it's so economically efficient, then why is it so completely dependent upon government subsidies for much of its success? So, that's where we're going. Rewriting the rules of the game is the perspective that I have for looking forward and what we need to do in order to consider changing the model. We need to include the cost of externalities in computing the cost of agricultural production, and we need to take a very honest look at the ways in which we subsidize industrialized production as a production model. Now, Jules Priddy, director of the Center for Environmental Society in England, makes a compelling argument and provides some data for us that says that if you really looked at all of the costs, industrialized production would not, in fact, be a more economical model. Well, what are some of the kinds of things that he's talking about here? I'm arguing today for developing a legal framework that brings some of those externalities into our model. Agriculture is exempted from many of the environmental laws that we have for other industries. And I think some of Charlie's pictures brought that up. As I mentioned to him at break, I said, gosh, you know, some of these industrialized operations produce more manure than a small city. We wouldn't think of allowing cities to not have wastewater treatment centers. Why is it that agriculture doesn't? We have government subsidies that then step in to help pay many of our ag polluters to help them to essentially develop the systems that they should have had factored into the costs of production to begin with. Now this gets to be controversial when you talk about it, because if you have an operation that's polluting, you do want it cleaned up, and it's in everybody's best interest to get it cleaned up. And the company comes back and says, well, I'm going to go out of business if I do that. So in many respects, you have to do one in order to deal with the problem in number two. Government funding for research. We have, particularly under the current administration, we have seen a number of a good amount of research dollars looking toward sustainability, looking toward small farm operations and producing local foods. We've really had, it doesn't get a lot of press sometimes, but we have had a dramatic turnaround at USDA in terms of policies on this. On the other hand, however, we have vested interests in the Agricultural Research Service and billions of dollars that are going out to universities all over the country, and many of those dollars are partnering with industry with respect to big food, big ag problems. And that's where the technological fixes are coming from the problems that we're creating. In Arkansas, we've got our Center for Poultry Excellence, okay? Largely funded by Mr. Tyson, but partnered with the university. And you know, at that center, they're not, well, I shouldn't say you know, but it's my suspicion that they're not researching how we can provide more diversity in our chicken population. We're trying to figure out how we can get chickens to grow faster and what we can do to them in order to keep them in close confinement even as much as possible and not get really sick. I mean, those are the things that we're focusing on, and those are your research dollars that are going into those studies. Intellectual property rights, we've had some mention of that as well, but the control that that goes along with the intellectual property rights, not just with respect to seeds, but also with respect to hybrid genetic lines in the poultry and the hog industry, is another avenue of advantage that we provide for industrialized agriculture. Farm subsidies. Farm subsidies, I mean, this is sort of, you know, this is the everywhere you hear Michael Pollan talking about corn these days, and that's a great thing. But it's true, we do tend to subsidize those crops, which the majority of them are used for either animal feed or industrialized production. We would not raise chickens and hogs and cattle the way that we do in the United States today if it weren't for our ability to produce cheap corn and soybeans for them to eat. Animal welfare standards, and this, you know, this is an animal welfare conference, and I don't want to get into some of the difficult issues involved with it, but really when you step back and you think about the protection laws that we have for domesticated animals that you raise as pets, and we're very proud of that as a country. You know, that's sort of a mark of our compassion and our civilization. The vast majority of conditions within industrialized agriculture would be illegal if it wasn't being done on a pig or a chicken or a calf. And that's something that we have not completely come to grips with, I think, in our food system. Corporate tax structure. There are many, I think quite a few in the audience here that would be able to address this much better than I can, but there are certainly advantages that we have in our tax structure which, again, puts the thumb on the scale of the industrialized production. And finally, government financing, and this is just sort of a little pet peeve for me because I just covered it in class this week and I always get a little worked up when I talk about it. But, you know, the poultry production that is so prevalent in southeastern United States in particular, you know, those farmers raise chickens under contract. They don't own the chickens, they're just paid by the weight gain. They contract with the poultry companies on quite short-term contracts. They used to be flock to flock. There's now, thanks again to efforts at the USDA, we're pushing to have longer-term contracts. Some people may have a 3-year contract. If you were a bank, would you make a $500,000 loan for a chicken house based on a 3-year contract? That's a 30-year mortgage. The reason that these loans get made is because most of them are guaranteed loans, because we have a wonderful, wonderful program, and I don't mean to criticize the program. We've got a wonderful program that helps out a lot of beginning farmers, a lot of minority farmers who cannot afford to get credit elsewhere. And so we have a great USDA program that helps provide financing for those farmers. But unfortunately, that program is also used to subsidize the lending industry with regard to contract production. And so when a farmer comes in and says, well, I can't get any bank in the country to loan money to me to build this poultry house, the USDA guarantees the loan at up to a 90% guarantee rate, and that's what's financing the industry. And now for the individual farmer who wants to be in poultry production, that's a great thing. And there certainly are farmers in Arkansas that I could, you know, put you in touch with that think that that has been a very good thing for their operation. Again, however, we have to look at that as a way that the government is actually influencing the way that we raise our food, and a way that the market would not otherwise support. Okay, so what are we going to do about this? Well, there's government policies that we can all influence. We can also rethink corporate shareholder goals, taking back control of corporations. Now, I know this is a little bit idealistic, but I think that we have to remember that the shareholders actually are the owners of the company. And there have been some rather exciting developments in the area of corporate social responsibility. Now, how effective that's going to be is going to depend on government, but it's also just going to depend upon who it is that is funding the corporations. And that's going to be the shareholders. So I would argue to not only vote with your fork, as Michael Pollan famously says, but perhaps you need to vote with your portfolio or your pension fund and take a look at what corporations you're are actually supporting and what influence you might be able to have on the market in that regard. The other thing I'd like to mention is, and I think that this is something that has to undercut our regulatory scheme for agriculture, and that's a regulation, or that's a concept really, that agriculture is simply different. And that goes back to the very beginning of my presentation of saying that it doesn't work to put the manufacturing model on the agricultural industry because it really is something different. And it's always actually been treated differently under the law. That's why there's an LLM program in ag laws, because it's all that stuff, those exceptions that you don't learn in law school because it's different and your professor doesn't want to teach that exception. But the paradigm for it being different shouldn't just be a regulatory scheme that exempts farmers from everything because of some rather outdated notion of Jeffersonian agrarianism, but actually because, again, it is a different industry. And I would argue that that difference creates responsibilities and sometimes the need for additional regulation rather than just less regulation. And these are sort of my three points that I would emphasize on that for the justification for it. It's food. We're talking about one of the, if not the most essential essential items that we can produce. It's the production of living things, which has a very wide impact, not just on the thing that you produce, but on the effect of the ecosystem, the effect of everything else that comes into contact with or is influenced by that living thing. And the last, the dependence upon the natural world. And again, our discussion that we had this morning on global climate change certainly emphasized that. Jumping back to the issue of meat consumption and meat production and the dramatic increase that we're seeing, that poses some real problems in terms of climate change. It also poses some real problems in terms of water usage, because the amount of water associated with the production of animals for food is something that is a little frightening when you look at some of the statistics. So the world that I would like to create, my world, if I were running the show here, would be an agriculture that was balanced to promote sustainable practices, ethical behavior, and the production of safe and healthy food. And I think we can get there, but the United States has to show a leadership role in this. We have already shown a leadership role, but on kind of the bad side of production. And I think we need to get back and get in front of those issues for the entire global food system. Now, we've got some impediments to change that I'd like to just mention real briefly, because these have, as I've been thinking about this and I was developing my presentation, I was really a little bit disturbed about some disagreements or some things that I see going on a lot in our current economic and political climate. We have a lot of current economic problems that right now are making it very difficult to think about things that may increase the cost of food. Is now a good time to talk about the fact that we don't want cheap food or we don't want cheap meat? Is this something that is in fact just the concern of the affluent? We have an incredible problem with food insecurity here in the United States. We have the largest divergence between the wealthy and the poor in the United States that we've had since they began taking census figures, and we now have the greatest split in our economy between the wealthy and the poor of any of the industrialized nations. You know, is it right for us to be thinking about food costs in that, can we just wait for a second, in that context? We also have some powerful vested interests that are making a lot of money on the way things are right now, and to be fair to them, they've also put a lot of money into it. And they're not going to give up on that vested interest, or they're not going to adjust to change very easily. When we talk about big food and big ag and some of the advantages that multinational corporations have in our food system, they're not going to change or accept additional regulation or additional cost without a significant fight, which leads us then to campaign financing. When you have industries that are able to now, under the Supreme Court, recent Supreme Court ruling, able to put unlimited amounts of money into campaigns and spend millions and millions of dollars advertising, telling us what we need and what things are bad and what things are good, and influencing public opinion. And I'll throw in just sort of my own pet peeve sometimes is the absolute ignorance of the American people sometimes, of being able to believe things that they hear or they read on the internet and they don't pay much attention to it, and they don't have any particular inquiry into what they believe. And then the last thing, which I also would just express some concerns about, and this is, you know, there's a lot of people in the food movement right now that I agree with a great deal, and that I support their concern for individual liberty and personal freedoms, and that touches very dear to my heart. Some of this comes up a little bit with in the raw milk discussions. The problem is that if we don't regulate right now, we're in effect allowing the corporations to do things that allow them to create food without taking credit for the externalities that are produced. If we don't have regulation over the application of manure, then what's the cheapest way to dispose of the manure? I mean, it's like either you have a regulatory structure that is in place to protect the interests of those that are not particularly powerful, or that are not in the that are affected by whether it's pollution or whether it's antibiotic resistance or the other factors that we talked about as potential problems. If we don't have the regulation, then we're essentially giving free rein to corporations to produce food without getting an accurate estimate of the true costs. And that's why many of my arguments are really very free market based, and really based a lot on personal freedoms, except that my personal freedom wants to see an accurate assessment of the cost to society for the way that we produce things. And so when, you know, Joel Salatin, who everybody loves, and I'm a complete supporter of his production methods, when he talks about the fact that the problem is that we just have too many regulations, I have to come back and I say, well, I don't really agree with that, and frankly, I don't think you'd be able to do what you're doing successfully if we didn't have some regulations. So that's my little political pitch. The administration right now obviously is getting a tough ride in the polls and in politics right now, but I think it would not be fair at this conference to talk about the issue of industrialization of agriculture without at least giving a bit of a pat on the back to the EPA and the USDA under the current administration. They may not be doing everything that you like. They're not pushing some issues nearly as far as I would like to see them push, but I cannot emphasize to you, as somebody who has sort of lives and breathes this stuff all the time. I cannot emphasize to you the change in this administration over the last administration. We're getting regulations over environmental problems that were not even heard of 3 or 4 years ago. The USDA is doing more right now to encourage the local food movement through the Know Your Farmer, Know Your Food program and a lot of its other agenda than we have ever seen at the USDA before. And please do understand the incredible pushback that they are getting. I don't know if any of you saw the letter from some of the Republican senators that was sent to Secretary Glickman complaining about the Know Your Farmer, Know Your Food program and wanting a specific accounting of how many dollars were going to those farmers associated with that program. And a lot of us, I think, in this room sort of assume that everybody's interested in local food and this is really a good thing. This is not a popular program among many of the agricultural producers that benefit from other USDA programs. My last slide here, this is just our a shameless plug for the LLM program. This is our new poster, and I've got my email address on there, so if anybody wants any sources for anything that I've talked about here or wants to further this discussion, please feel free to send me an email. And I have some brochures about the LLM program that you can pick up if you're interested. Thank you. Couple minutes for questions?
I think we have about 5 minutes for questions.
Yes, you had a question before. Yes.
You were talking about the economics and is it fair? When I look at the low-quality foods that are really unhealthy and what it's doing to the economy in terms of the health system, and folks who are having to choose between buying medications to treat the illnesses they have, they choose between medicine or food, and the food is causing craving the need for the medicine, that's kind of all wound up together.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to comment on that.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. It's sometimes the difference, though, between short-term interests and long-term interests, too. And the long-term is where we have to be looking. But, that's hard if you're out of work and...
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I had another appointment, and I was late, and I missed most of what you had to say, and maybe you talked about this already, but my parents retired to Bella Vista, Arkansas.
Okay.
And that Northwest Regional Airport out there in the middle of a bunch of chicken farms is really close to the Walmart distribution center.
Yes.
And so if you could comment on how much you think the corporate world, not associated directly with agriculture, is driving this whole process.
Yeah. Well, one thing I certainly can comment on specifically is Walmart, and it's a little bit of a mixed bag. I mean, I know that there are impacts in local communities that Walmart, that raise problems for Walmarts. There are certainly local businesses that have been put out of business because a Walmart comes in and undercuts everybody. There are, I mean, you could all come up with all of your anti-Walmart facts or feelings about it. The one thing that has been very interesting, though, about Walmart is the way that they have jumped onto the sustainability bandwagon and in terms of pushing their suppliers. And Walmart, when they push their suppliers, number one, they push very hard, and number two, the suppliers jump. I mean, they have been, they've been really incredible environmentally in terms of eliminating packaging, in terms of developing more local initiatives. They have a fairly significant program that they're testing and hopefully will be a model for trying to develop local sources for a lot of their foods. Just in Arkansas now, I can get a better selection of local and organic produce in my Walmart than I can get at the other grocery stores. Now, maybe that's partly Northwest Arkansas because they're so centered there. But it's an example, I think, of an industry at least attempting to do some good things, and they feel that it's going to, I mean, they feel that it's in their best interest from a profit standpoint.
Do you think that'll ripple out into the poultry production and how the farming goes on?
I don't see it impacting industrialized meat production at this point. Yeah, somebody else had their hand up on that too.
NPR did a thing on Walmart with buying food from within like the local distribution center of the farmers nearby. And what some commentators were saying though is what they do with these farmers is they require that they produce X amount so that Walmart can then sell it because they have a certain quantity. And then the next year when they go to renew the contract and the farmer has expanded all these operations, then they try to undercut them and try to get them to lower their prices. So in the long run, they're not thinking it is good for these local farming operations because they're just kind of moving them towards this industrial, you know, because they need to satisfy the quantity that Walmart demands.
Well, and that's the problem with the big with the large store. Is it's you know, people come in and they want blueberries whenever they want them, and if the blueberry production wasn't that good this year, or if you know, it's to a certain extent that's a little bit driven by consumer demand, but I think your point is very well taken. The one thing that I might, if for people that are interested in that angle on it, the Applied Center for Sustainability, which if you Google that, you can find their address, but they're at the University of Arkansas and they've been largely funded by Walmart, has had a series of conferences of trying to figure out if there's a way that we can have a regional distribution center, such as a cooperative, that would take in produce from a lot of small farmers into a regional distribution. I guess I think probably the cooperative model would work the best, but so that it wouldn't have to be one farmer that was providing all the tomatoes, but maybe if all the farmers in a region had somewhere that they could easily bring their tomatoes, and the stores, not just Walmart, but other stores could buy through that, maybe they wouldn't all have to be shipped from California. So but Applied Center for Sustainability has been doing work in that area. So. Mm-hmm.
What do you say to, I mean, if a company like Tyson comes to you and says, okay, well, we're happy to internalize the environmental costs, sustainability costs, but then tell us how we compete against the Brazilian manufacturers or the manufacturers in other countries. What's the answer to that?
I don't think there's an easy answer, and that's exactly what they say. I mean, they say, well, sure, if you don't like the environmental costs here, we'll raise our poultry in Mexico. Smithfield is producing, what, 600, 800,000 pigs in Mexico a year? I think one of the responses to that is one of the reasons why I was very much in favor of country of origin labeling. I mean, I think people can know where their meat comes from that way. But that's one of that relates to one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about the issue as kind of a global problem, because it doesn't just work to do it here unless people are only going to buy from products from the United States, and I'm not real comfortable with that model either. So, but I think you've hit on a tough point. I think we may be out of time. Okay, thank you. If anybody wants to share their questions with me, I'll be around the rest of the afternoon. Thank you.